Next up, we have Dr. Charles Colgan, Professor Emeritus of Public Policy and Planning and Senior Advisor at the Maine Center for Business and Economic Research at the University of Southern Maine. Dr. Colgan will give us an update on the Maine economy. You can submit questions for Dr. Colgan by using the group chat. There's a tool embedded in your streaming window. Your questions will be shared with him after his presentation, and his answers will be published in our post-conference email. Those of you going for continuing education credits, now is a good time to review the exam questions at the bottom of the screen. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Colgan.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Since Earl started or included in his presentation the reference to Harriet Beecher Stowe, it calls to mind a story that when she met Abraham Lincoln at one point, she was introduced to him and he said, "So you're the little lady who started this great war." Put up the first slide. So here you can see the little strand of RNA that started this great mess. Now, the story about Stowe and Lincoln is almost certainly apocryphal. The coronavirus, alas, is not. And so to consider where we are and what it has done to Maine and will do to Maine in the future, I want to take a look quickly at where we are today and identify some of the factors that will shape the future. In many ways, we are at a situation somewhat like Joshua Chamberlain in Maine faced at the end of the Civil War, where we are ending one period and beginning another whose outlines are still not at all clear, even with our better tools of economics and modeling. We still don't know a lot more than the folks who came out of the Civil War did, as I'll try and show you. Sticking with our historical theme, next slide. We can divide our current period into three categories. Again, with an apocryphal Western theme here, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the 1960s Sergio Leone films starring Clint Eastwood. I'll show you that there are parts of the Maine economy that would fit into each of these characteristics. The first is the good, the next slide. One of the things that is kind of interesting, Maine rarely gets the top of the charts, but we are in the CNN Back to Normal Index, #1 in the country. 93% of the indicators that they are looking at for return to a normal economy are present in Maine, and all other 49 states and the DC are behind us. Not often that we get to top the economic charts in anything, even if it is a somewhat made up number from a set of indicators. The next chart, next slide. Another thing that's happening is that our performance, our labor market performance relative to the US hasn't been all that bad. We are looking here at the seasonally adjusted labor rates, unemployment rate rather. As you can see, the US is well above us. We've been below the US since for most of the last 10 years. Our unemployment rate has come down quite significantly, just as the US has, even though we experienced something of a spike in the middle of the summer in the seasonally adjusted rate, and that's mostly because of what's going on in the tourism and hospitality sectors. But we're not doing too bad relative to the US, given the situation that we find ourselves in. Next slide. In addition, if you look at our employment to population ratio, so the unemployment rate is a kind of funny number because it represents the proportion of the people in the labor force who are not employed. But being in the labor force is a matter of having a job or looking for a job. Broader measure is the unemployment to population ratio. Again, we've done at least as well as the US. We didn't fall as far, and we have done significantly at least as well as the US in coming back in terms of the proportion of our working age population with a job. Still not great, but our performance has certainly not been worse than the country as a whole, which historically we've almost always been worse than the country as a whole. Next slide. This is also reflected in the labor force participation rate, um, which is the proportion of our working age population in the labor force, that is, looking for a job or has a job. Again, actually, our recovery has been faster than the US. Next slide. Clearly, another hopeful sign here is in the real estate market. So this is the residential sales from the Maine Association of Retail, seasonally adjusted. This is the data we put in the Merida Index. I don't have, unfortunately, the commercial data. I couldn't access that in time. The blue represents the number of units sold. The orange represents the median price. These are, again, both seasonally adjusted. And this is monthly data, not quarterly data. So as you can see, the recovery from the Great Recession, which was beginning in the latter part of 2010, in terms of the number of units sold, yeah, it took a hit in the spring of this year, but it's largely recovered. The median price again took a small hit, but actually has hit an all-time high in the most recent data for August. So the real estate market, unlike other parts of the economy, has actually done pretty well. And a large part of that is shown in the next slide, which is the 30-year mortgage rate at 2.87%, a full percentage point or 100 basis points below where it was at the beginning of the year. This, of course, is the result of Fed policy, but there's no expectation that this is going to change greatly. Next slide shows another piece of good news, and here and in the next several slides, we're going to talk about really kind of anomalous things between this period and the Great Recession. This is construction employment. The top represents seasonally adjusted data from 2006 to September. I'm sorry, to August in the current employment series. And what you see here is that the construction industry is still not back to where it was in 2006 before the Great Recession, but it has been steadily increasing. What you look at here on the bottom chart is you see the year change month over a year ago month change in construction employment. And you can see a massive hit in the Great Recession and hardly a blip in the drop in this recession. In fact, the total construction employment seasonally adjusted is only down about 600 jobs. So the construction industry and the residential, commercial, and public construction projects have managed to keep going. It's largely, of course, because most of them are outside. But the construction industry has been an absolute anomaly in the current situation, and one of the few really, really positive ones in terms of employment. Now, we got to start looking at the flip side of this. So the next slides, I talk about the bad. And here we're starting to look at some of the real weaknesses. They're not really ugly, but they are not very pretty either. They're more typical, I would say, of what you would see in a recession. So the next one is just now we look at the total non-farm employment. You can see the Great Recession there in that sort of downward red chart, red bars in 2008 to 2010. You can see the big drop there, and then you can see what's happened this year. And it's I don't want to say it's off the charts, but let's just say that we had to completely rebuild the charts in order to show what's happened this year. Next slide. The effects of the coronavirus um, pandemic response, the shutdowns, the reductions in economic activity, show up in all sectors, including a number of them that we wouldn't expect to see a lot of effects. So while most of the kind of work that we all do has been able to move online, there has still been a significant drop, for example, in management employment of a type that has not been seen in the last 10 years. And if you look at the next slide, which is employment in manufacturing. Now, here we see a more typical situation. We've seen big drops in manufacturing employment this year, but you'll notice that that is actually just a little bit worse than what we saw in the Great Recession. This is very typical of recessions in the manufacturing sector, and it's unclear how we'll come out of that. You'll notice the kind of long-term weakness, and really only in the last 3 years have you seen steady improvement in the manufacturing employment side of the economy. Um, the next slide shows traffic on the main turnpike, which is a very good indicator of the overall health of the main economy. If I had to pick one indicator of the current status of overall output in the main economy, it's traffic on the turnpike. They correlate extremely closely together and very statistically significant. So this is the green bars represent total volume of traffic by month, and from January to June. I don't have the July and August figures, but they are higher than June. And so you can see after a dramatic drop in April, you see a steady progression through the end of June, and that continued into August and probably September. But you'll notice that even in June, although we were back up to just under where January traffic was, we were still 2.4 million vehicles below where we were a year ago. And you see a similar situation in the next slide, which is jet ports, employments at the jet port. Again, you see a dramatic drop in the spring. There are only 5,400 people who took a flight out of Portland in April, which is just a staggeringly low number. It has climbed back to about 66,000 in July, and there's probably around 70,000 or so, or 80,000 now. But you'll notice we're still 170,000 plus below year ago traffic. So there's positive signs in this, but we are still way below in our transportation indicators, which are very closely correlated with the overall health of the economy, where we would need to be to just be back to where we were a year ago. And finally, the ugly. And some of this really is ugly. So one of the first ones is the next slide, which is retail trade. Now you would expect this is, of course, high contact, high touch, high involvement, personal involvement employment. So you expect it to be bad. In fact, it's really awful. There has been some recovery, but by and large, the year-over-the-year changes far exceed what happened in the Great Recession. And you'll notice the red lines, the red bars on the bottom suggest that the drop in the retail trade employment, and you've probably seen this in your own business if you're in the commercial side of the real estate business. The drop in real estate activity was going on long before the pandemic hit. The pandemic created an artificial sinkhole for the retail sector, but there was clearly something else going on beyond what happened in the pandemic in terms of the demand for employment in the retail industry. The next one is accommodation. Next slide is accommodation and food services. These are hotels and restaurants, bars, and so on. Again, looking back to the Great Recession, hardly any movement, but a total collapse. In this period, a modest amount of recovery through the late summer. This is mostly people being able to go back to restaurants. Hotels remain very much underemployed relative to history. And again, you can see this employment is which is about in 2019. Accommodation food services was about 1 in 11 jobs in Maine, and the loss was almost half at the depths of the spring. Similarly, next slide is arts, entertainment, and recreation. Similar kinds of problems. You'll notice here that there has been hardly any recovery at all in this sector. And this is primarily, almost certainly, because of continued restrictions on large crowds, whether that be in museums or concert venues or theaters or similar kinds of activities. So taken together, the accommodation, retail, and arts, entertainment, and recreation are pretty much ugly. The next slide is education and health services. Again, I'm sorry, did I hit one wrong? Yeah, professional and technical services. I wanted to show this one because there is a sense out there that these kinds of services have almost entirely stayed operational because of the shift to technology. In fact, that's not true. In fact, professional and technical service employment has taken a hit that is over the last several months about what it was in the Great Recession. And I think that this is primarily a feedback loop from the overall economy to these kinds of jobs that technology itself has not been able to solve. The next one is education and health services. Again, a sector you don't expect to see job losses in. You see only tiny little random variations in it prior to 2020, and then just another huge collapse. Most of this is in education. Most of this is in local government and school systems. Speaking of government, the next slide shows state government. Now, what's interesting here is that ever since the Great Recession, the state government employment has been declining from a peak in 2006 of about 28,000 jobs to, before the recession, about 26,000 jobs, now at about 24,000 jobs, and no recovery in sight on this. And in fact, without some sort of substantial help from the federal government, this sector will probably lose another 4,000 to 6,000 jobs over the next couple of years, preventing the economy from getting back to full employment. And a similar situation in the next slide for local government. A little bit of a recovery here as various jobs came back. This is seasonally adjusted, so I'm not sure it's all summer kinds of jobs. Again, long-term trend towards less and less employment here. If you just climb back to the rate of job loss of 1,000 or 2,000 a year in local government, and there are about 65,000 people employed in this sector, it would be a miracle. Next slide. So I want to talk about the future. In the short term, and by the short term, I basically mean the next couple of years, there are two drivers. The first, and by far the most important, is the virus and how fast we get that under control. And there are several big unknowns. Will the current rather feeble response to the pandemic stay in place or not? Will a vaccine be developed and available for distribution? How effective will the vaccine be? How many people will take the vaccine? Right now, there are surveys that suggest that maybe only 2 people in 3 will even take the vaccine. And so, with all of those variables in mind, quite apart from the government's policy on this, it's not at all clear when the health-induced pressure on the economy is going to alleviate. Earliest late 2021, I think. But you could easily see the current situation continuing well into 2022 um, if the various factors like efficacy and vaccination rates break the wrong way. The other thing is obviously policy. I won't talk too much about this. There is obviously a choice coming up here between a policy that will be relatively active in uh, alleviating the problems in the economy and a policy that will be relatively inactive. We'll just have to wait and see what happens. So the short term is going to be influenced mostly by these two drivers, and of the two, the by far the most important is going to be how fast we can get the virus under control, because it is the thing that has driven this whole event. Beyond that, the next slide, we face a fork in the road. And there are really kind of two basic, there are a lot of basic tensions about where we're going to go that we just don't really know the answer to. One of them is in the next slide, what I'm calling the disruption in the spatial economy. Basically, we reinvented much of our use of space in about a 2-week period in March. And this is going to have profound long-term effects on the economy. The big issue here, for example, is what about office space? So the left picture here shows WEX and its new office space down on Commercial Street. It was built for the pre-pandemic world. And Google's headquarters in Mountain View, California. And Google, as well, WEX has kind of kept people away. And I don't know what their plans are for return. Google has said, to its employees, don't even bother thinking about coming back until 2022. Well, if you've ever seen the Google complex or the Googleplex, you'll know that there's a massive amount of real estate tied up in that, and a huge volume of people moving in and around the Silicon Valley area. If everybody stays home, it's a very different world. So, are we going to go back to the office? Are we going to go back to a different office? Do we need the same amount of space or more space for a socially distanced world? Does the vaccine fit into that? Or are we going to stay away from the office and maybe not even build offices anymore, or at least not build them at the size that we have, with the expectation that everybody will show up every day? A second area is on the residential side. In the next slide, one of the things that we're witnessing in the Maine economy is kind of astonishing to me, having tracked this over 40 years. From November 2019 to August 2020, almost half of the residential permits issued in Maine were for multifamily units, or units more than one family, more than one dwelling unit per permit. Historically, multifamily units have only been 10% of the construction in Maine. 90% was all single family units, and now it's almost half is 2 units or more. And that's really remarkable. So, are we coming back to a society of density and housing? Or is the coronavirus, as many people have suggested, going to break the cities up and send everybody into the suburbs, into the deep suburbs, and even into the next state, or even farther, where they can do their job remotely? So, one set of forces pulling us back together, another set of forces pushing us apart. And that brings us to the next great issue here, which is transportation. If we are all, a good portion of us, living our lives on Zoom or Vimeo or the equivalent thereof, we don't need to travel as much. We don't need to commute twice a day. The congestion on the main turnpike, the plans of the turnpike for extending a toll road west into the suburbs of Portland. The map that you see on the right is from a project I worked on with the Turnpike Authority more than 10 years ago. Do we need any of that stuff now? I don't know. And neither does anybody else. And the next slide, what about tourism? So the picture you see on the left is Higgins Beach in Scarborough in 2018. The picture you see on the right is from the same place in 2020. Um, Higgins Beach was, in fact, pretty well occupied most of the summer, and most people did stay pretty far apart. It wasn't too bad. I ride my bike down to Higgins Beach all the time, so I get to. It's kind of my indicator on this. But where is tourism going to go? Travel and tourism worldwide has just been clobbered. What about the cruise ships? Are they coming back? So tourism as a whole faces a future in which I think people are still going to travel. People still need vacations. People are still going to want to go to the beach. If there's a beach left after sea level rise, that's another story. Um, uh, but in what form and shape and how will that take place? So, last slide. Like America emerging from the Civil War, we face, I think, a very different future. Coming back from the Civil War, the era of the schooners, of Bath Iron Works, of the paper industry, the beginnings of the textile, of the clothing mills, all of that lay in the future in Maine, and nobody could quite envision it because many of the technologies had not even been perfected yet. Just as those technological innovations and the revolutions in the allocation of capital in the post Civil War era restructured the Maine economy from an artisanal natural resource economy to an industrial natural resource economy. So the factors at work here, the economics restructuring of space, concentration versus dispersion, the demographics, which we still face, we're still an old workforce, we're still looking at a diminishing workforce over the next 10 to 20 years, and it has largely been offset by immigration. Immigration might increase dramatically if people can move here and do their job in Massachusetts, or in my case, California. Um, uh, but on the other hand, a major part of our our workforce change has been in international migration, which has been virtually shut down, and if certain circumstances occur, will be virtually shut down, perhaps for this entire decade. And finally, climate change, which I haven't talked about, is the other dominant theme of this decade. The costs of climate change are no longer avoidable, they are present. We're going to pay the costs one way or another. The only question is, what costs are we going to pay? The high cost of doing nothing, or the lower but still significant costs of adapting to climate change and mitigating our contributions to global climate change. So those are the major issues that I see facing us. I don't know which way it's going to go. I can see conflicts, I can see tensions, I can see all kinds of different possible futures for Maine. I only know that we are at that fork in the road, and how it will play out in the short term between the virus and the Congress, and the long term between these dispersive and concentrating forces, uh, will be basically the story of the next 20 years.